Hello. Are you having a good AstriCon so far? Of course you are. It's AstriCon. Now, I just want to tell you before we get our next keynoter along about the fastest dude to the dial tone competition. Some people have asked how this came about in the first place, and it came about because the very first contest 5 or 6 years ago was actually a blank Linux machine with the Asterisk source code on the hard drive, along with a Digium card and an analog phone connected to it, and it was literally the fastest dude to the dial tone. What you had to do was compile Asterisk and get a dial tone on your analog phone. That's where it all started, but in subsequent years we've had different contests. This year is called Fastest Dude Mission Impossible, because you can bring your own device, bring your own laptop with Asterisk, bring your own soft phone, and you have to connect up where you will be given instructions over the phone about the next part of the contest, and you have to do the next part before your machine self-destructs. That's the Mission Impossible part. And as usual, up for grabs are some fantastic Fastest Dude prizes, with one of them being Bose noise-cancelling headphones for the flight home. Woo! There's I think there's a Fitbit in there somewhere as well. So some great prizes. If you're wondering where this all is, it's on the exhibition floor, which is that way or that way, the exhibition floor, and it's in the corner where our open source showcase is, where the guys from Camelio, OpenSips and Homer are. That's where the fastest dude is. Okay, without further ado, I want to introduce our next keynoter. We're excited because this is the first AstriCon where we've had free PBX World along, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce Bill Wignall, CEO of Sangoma, for his keynote.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me okay? Is the mic on? Yes? Okay, thank you, David. Good afternoon. It's an honor to be with you for the keynote today. As you may know from David's introduction, my name is Bill Wignall. I'm the CEO at Sangoma. And from the signs outside or the abstract, I've been asked to talk about innovation and transformational change inside technology companies. So I thought one interesting place to start might be when, at some point in history, did people start thinking about change and its impact on society and other people? So here's where we'll begin. The first writing about change and its role is around 2,500 years ago, 500 BC, before Socrates. It's a Greek philosopher named Heraclitus, born in present-day Turkey. And he writes, as you can see, there's nothing permanent except change. Change alone is unchanging. And we'll see as we spend the next 25 or 30 minutes together that quote is especially relevant in technology businesses. And we go from 2,500 years ago, serious, heavy thinking, to today with a little bit of humor and lightheartedness as I try and compete with your food and lunch. Nothing better than Dilbert, and the boss says we need to foster a culture of innovation. Does anyone have an idea how we can do that? Well, you could give us less work, of course, and you could stop criticizing every little idea we have. Does anyone have a suggestion that isn't ridiculous? And as we talk through this topic over the next half an hour, I think you'll see that the role of leaders in enabling change in technology organizations and the role of the organization itself is mimicked here. And we'll come back to that theme. So, why was it me who was asked to give this talk? What does Sangoma have to do with change, and why Wignall, and what credibility do we have when speaking on the topics of innovation and transformational change in tech businesses? So one of the key things about giving an address like this is making sure one does not get into self-promotion and marketing of one's company, so I promise we're not going to do that. This is just meant to give you a little bit of credibility about where we're coming from. So Sangoma is an old company, 30 years, a VoIP pioneer, very successful IPO, publicly listed, a pioneer in Asterisk as well, significant contributor to the code base and commercial success. And yet, as I stand here with you, I can tell you quite honestly that around 5 years ago, things didn't look that great. Sangoma was struggling. It was a one-product company, and it was heavily dependent upon the PSTN. The PSTN was in decline. The organization didn't really know what to do about it. There was a change of leadership. This is the 5th or 6th organization I've run. New team brought in to figure out, so what do we do with the business and how might that be relevant to a discussion today on change? Well, what I'll say is there's a unique perspective that I think companies like Sangoma, although many others as well, and you'll see me talk a little bit about Digium in a couple of places because they've gone through some of this as well, might be able to bring to bear. So 5 years ago, Sangoma was a single product company. It had a single customer segment, which was the SMB category sold to through resellers, and it basically operated in one geography. It was a North American-based company, almost all of our customers in the US. And over 2 or 3 years, the company was basically ripped apart and rebuilt. And I can tell you that as the guy leading that ripping apart and rebuilding, it's not a lot of fun at the time. Right? People have been with us for a long time, very loyal, kind of accustomed to the way things had worked, and creating change is highly disruptive, as you'll see. And so we go from a single product line company to a business that has not just telephony cards, but cards and gateways and session border controllers and video and link and free PBX, keeping the roots in open source and Asterisk, all within 2 or 3 years, partly through organic, internally funded R&D and lots of hard work, and partly through a few strategic acquisitions. We go from a single customer segment of SMB to SMB and enterprise and carriers and application developers and OEMs. And we go from a single continent operating almost exclusively in North America to a global company which is operating on all continents with staff in all regions and opening up offices and customers around the world. And that kind of a change process wreaks havoc on the organization. We changed 6 of the 7 executives and more than half of the staff going through that process. So there's the end of the Sangoma story. I'm happy to talk about it more afterwards if anyone wants to know more. Let's go into the conversation about change and how it might affect your businesses. So if change is happening, what do we have to do, and do we need to change at all? Maybe not. There's another option, right? One option is, what if we don't change anything at all and something magical just happens? Right? Maybe. I'm not sure you want to bet the future of your company on it, but it is a strategy. Lots of business schools study stuff like this. My advice or input or counsel would be maybe this is not the optimum strategy. So most of us might agree that the drivers of change are not a human nature wish to go through this. It's thrust upon us. It's not something we seek or desire. Humans don't want to change. It's that the world changes around us. And so innovation is one of the ways to adapt to that changing world, and we'll talk about the role of innovation versus other kinds of change, a technical solution versus a non-technical or more business solution that compels us to change, at least to survive and at best to thrive. And in the abstract, perhaps you notice the phrase evolve or dissolve. And we'll talk about those options and what evolution looks like and what happens if you don't evolve and what does dissolve look like. So here's a couple of examples of what does dissolve look like. Maybe it looks like that. Or maybe like that. Or maybe it looks like Blockbuster. Or maybe like Polaroid. So here are 4 examples of what were highly successful businesses over a long period of time that now either ceased to exist or are shells of their former self. And what happened, right? You know the stories, I guess. Kodak missing the transition away from film, Borders not being able to compete in the shift from bricks and mortar stores to online bookselling, Blockbuster not adapting well to streaming video, and Polaroid missing the instant camera, no longer really being relevant if I can see the the picture immediately on my digital camera or cell phone. So perhaps you buy into the idea that change is important, and if you don't change, there's a risk of dissolve, and so you want to evolve. And what's happening to the speed of change, and what does that tell us about technology businesses today? Well, I guess the argument that I would make today for you is that the change is speeding up. It's not just that change is continuing, it's accelerating. This is a simple little graphic that shows the length of time it took each of these technologies to reach 50 million users. And at the top, you see the telephone taking, 75 years or something like that. And you see radio at 38 years. You can go down the list. I won't read them all to you, right? PCs at 18. The first technology to get to 50 million users in less than a year that we could find is Facebook. You see towards the bottom, the iPad does it in just about a quarter, and Angry Birds does it in just about a month. So you see the pace of technology accelerating. But what about in our industry? What about communications? What's happening there? And the story is similar, but even more pronounced. And here we look back on 150 years of communications, the invention of the telephone or just before 1850, and we look at the big milestones along the way. The first exchange or switch. This is not an automated switch. It's not the old mechanical crossbars that, for those of you who are old like me, this is the switchboards, right? Without trying to be sexist, this is probably a lady sitting there plugging in cords, connecting phones. Then around the turn of the century, we get radio, television around 1927. And then you look at, 3 or 4 decades in which the rate of invention skyrockets. You can read them, you don't need me to go through them. Digital switching, cell phones, internet, all the way up to cloud, mobile apps, wearables. And so the trend that we saw in technology in general is happening even to a greater extent in communications technologies. So it seems obvious, right? Change is happening around us. The industry that we play in is changing. So why don't more companies adapt and evolve? What are the obstacles to changing that you and your companies might encounter? We're going to talk about 3 of those obstacles. We'll talk a little bit about weak leadership and what role that plays, a little bit about risk and how that affects an organization's ability to adapt, and we'll talk about the fact that it's kind of ugly, it's painful or unpleasant going through these disruptive periods where you're trying to innovate and come up with new ideas, and the engineering department's overloaded and everybody's stressed out. So let's talk about the first one, weak leadership. A little bit of humor again. What we need is an overarching strategy to stimulate our innovation. Or, says Dilbert, you could stop smothering the innovation we already have. That's the dumbest idea I have ever heard, and there it is. And so one of the problems with leadership is if it lacks vision, and lacking vision might mean the leaders in the organization don't see the change that's coming, being thrust upon them, or maybe they do see it, but they're just afraid or paralyzed and don't help the organization to adapt in spite of that change. They don't innovate because it's too hard or too scary, or we don't have the right engineering talents, or it's going to cost a lot. Or worse, they see it, but they see it too late. And then the leadership is scrambling, trying to squeeze an innovation project that should take 54 engineers 2 years into 7 people in 8 months. And maybe some of you have been in organizations where leaders do that. So if leaders lack vision, then change is either unlikely, or if it's the third of those examples, it's obstructed. Let's talk about the second obstacle, the fact that it's risky. So change involves doing something new. Maybe you've heard that funny saying, the definition of insanity. People or organizations to do the same thing over and over and over again and expect a different answer, the 31st time. So almost by definition, change and innovation involves something new. You need to learn new things, or you need to hire new engineers, or it needs new training. And yet, in spite of realizing that, there are many risks that impede change. Maybe it's the loss of money or capital. Perhaps your organization is, I don't know, allocating a pot of money to fund an R&D project. Or maybe you've gone outside the company and raised capital with a VC firm or a private equity organization. Or maybe you're already public and you tap into the public equity markets. Or maybe there's a risk of loss of customers. The people you've sold to for years will not like this new initiative or new direction, and they feel like this is not the company we bought from before. They're going off on a tangent. You know, that's not who we want to do business with. Or maybe this is the risk of failure. You fund this new R&D project to be innovative, and it doesn't work. Project's released, it's at the alpha stage, doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Or it gets to beta, and it's out in the marketplace, and the customers who you hoped would embrace it don't really love it that much, right? And so there's not just the failure, there's the loss of the money, respect, maybe you lose face as an organization, an engineering team, a leader. And creating the ability to execute such projects needs both money and resources. And so often strategy is about not only what you will do, but what you'll choose to stop doing, what you won't do. And if I was to be completely candid with you and a little vulnerable up here on stage, and you had the Sangoma executive team, they would say, this is Wignall's weakest point. I hate letting go of stuff. I know I'm bad at it. I need other people around me who say, no, you're wrong, don't be an idiot. We have to stop doing that. It's really hard for me to let go of things that are still generating some revenue in some business, but sometimes it's mandatory. And then the third obstacle to change is that it's painful. Our differentiating value-added strategy is transformational change, claims the leader. How is that? Does anyone feel any different? My urge to hurl has just increased a little bit, says one of the employees. Well, that's what change feels like. And so change does feel like making you hurl in many parts of the organization. And so this is resistance or obstacles not from the leadership team, but in the middle of the organization. You can feel impediments at the top if leaders don't lead, and you can feel resistance in the middle if the rest of the company doesn't feel it's, okay. Okay means safe or acceptable. Is the organization risk tolerant? Does it accept failure? So let's assume you get courageous enough, the organization's brave, and you're going to adapt to the change that's being thrust upon you. What does it look like inside technology organizations when they go through this process? It's bloody ugly, right? It's scary, and it's dangerous, and you don't know if it's going to work, and someone might lose their job, and what if the company stumbles or worse fails, and everybody loses their job? But, that's kind of the deal. When I'm teaching, I do some teaching at some of the big universities in North America, and the difference between teaching at an engineering level to an engineering faculty and MBA class is huge. The MBA classes have been taught for 2 decades how to mitigate risk. How do I avoid causing my company to fail? And the engineering faculties are completely the opposite. Young kids full of vinegar and excited about new things and not afraid to fail, and I'm 22 years old and I'm just starting my career. And so if you're a risk-averse person or your organization, because this is not just about companies, right? This is about companies or education institutions or hospital networks or governments. If your organization is risk-averse and not tolerant of failure, maybe you're in the wrong industry, right? This is an industry where if you don't adapt, if you don't see change coming, the probability of failure is much higher than if you work for a utility company or a railroad or any of the old industries. So let's talk about 2 lessons for companies going through that difficult, dangerous process. We'll talk about the fact that change is not always innovation and how do they differ. And we'll talk a bit about when innovating, what is the first mover advantage? Does it guarantee success or not? So the first one, change does not equal innovation. So what I mean here is, of course, one way to change or to adapt to the change being thrust upon you is innovating. You're going to create some new invention. But it's not the only way. There are other ways to change, and there are advantages to both, and we'll discuss each of them. So innovation has changed, the first option. This is the one that I would guess 80 or 90% of you and your organizations default to when you need to innovate, when you need to change and something's going on in the industry that's causing the company to not be as successful as it might have been at one time. We're engineering heavy, driven by engineering talent. I are one, so I kind of get it. I'm an engineer by my undergrad training too. So we default to change being driven by technical innovation. New technologies, new products, sometimes new science, so that's of course more rare. Some examples might be Fairchild creating the commercial integrated circuit for the first time, Stallman and GNU, maybe, I don't know, Linus Torvalds and Linux. Mark, where's Mark? I was dinner with Mark. Hi, Mark. Asterisk, the story I told you about Sangoma going through this change from cards to cards and gateways and SBCs and free PBX, etc. When it works, this kind of change is awesome. It's the best. It's the most fun. It's the most rewarding. It's usually the most financially impacting for the organization, but admittedly, it is risky. It's more risky. So how might we change in ways that are not necessarily purely about innovation? Lots of options, lots of approaches, but we might consider targeting new markets or repositioning our company to new customers. And then I've given you, I don't know, 3 or 4 examples. Facebook refocusing on mobile. Facebook goes through the IPO. It's the most highly touted IPO in a decade, and the stock kind of falls on its face soon after its public offering. And it falls on its face not because people don't believe in Facebook. You saw it was the first organization to get to more than 50 million users in less than a year ever. Because everybody's nervous about the shift from social networks being used primarily on desktop and laptops to mobile smartphones. And so Facebook kind of repositions the company. And I can tell you from talking to them over long periods of time, it kind of becomes the entire theme of the business there for a year or two. Or the Sangoma story of targeting carriers and applications developers, not just SMB. That wasn't new products. It's finding new types of customers and new segments, or focusing on new economies. This is an example of how companies can sometimes extend the life cycle of a product. I told you Sangoma, to some extent true for Digium, involved in these telephony cards that connect the PSTN to IP systems. One of the things that one realizes is the shift from one technology to the next happens earlier in Western developed democracies with more advanced economies, and happens then once it started more quickly than it does in other parts of the world. So one of Sangoma's strategies was start paying attention to India and Latin America and Russia and China and Brazil, where that shift away from the PSTN happened later, and it's going through that shift more slowly because they don't have the financial resources to drive the change as quickly as is happening in North America and Western Europe. Digium's launch of Respoke under Danny's leadership, something I respect very much and I'm watching with tons of interest. It's very innovative, a lot of change going on there. Other examples from earlier companies I'd run, Truition was, so I was asked to give you some examples, so I hope this isn't boring to you. Truition was a company in the e-commerce platform space. It made software as a service products hosted in multi-tenant environments, and customers would pay $5,000 a month to put their e-commerce business into these platforms. The fundamental problem was the company had raised $30 million in capital, and the ventures capital companies and the private equity institutional investors had said enough. You're not finding a path to profitability. You're consuming $5 million a year. There's no end in sight. We're changing out the executive team and find someone who can figure out what to do. And so the fundamental problem, which it only took a month to uncover, although it was much harder to solve, was it was costing $250,000 to launch a customer onto the platform, and that customer paid $5,000 a month. right? So you don't have to be Einstein, not even a modestly intelligent CEO to figure out, that grade 4 arithmetic doesn't work, right? So what do you do? And my counsel was, you only have 2 choices, unfortunately. It's really simple. It's a hard choice, but it's easy to figure out what the options are. One is you spend a bunch more money on R&D and you change the product, right? You make it not cost $250,000 to launch a new customer. You make the product more self-serve, and customers select in, they put themselves on the platform, and $5,000 a month becomes profitable. It's okay. But it's 50 engineers for 2 years, and you have to fund the R&D program. Do you like that or not? So if you're a VC firm or a private equity firm who's put in $30 million over 4 years, they say, no, I don't like that one. What's the other option, Bill? The other option is you have to reposition the company to a different set of customers. So you go up market, you look for big Fortune 100, Fortune 500 banks, packaged goods companies, Procter & Gamble, large consumer electronics customers who are happy to pay $25,000 or $50,000 a month. It's okay that it costs $250,000 to launch, but you have to reposition the whole company, right? The sales model no longer works. We had a bunch of inside salespeople and a channel. Channels are great at selling $5,000 products. They're not so good at selling $50,000 a month products, where you need a field sales force, visiting the customer, going through RFPs, doing presentations. So these changes are highly disruptive to the organization. EWB, Electronics Workbench, was an earlier business I'd run. It was a company that had an education software product. This education software product was used to teach young engineers about electronic circuitry. But at the core of the product was this IP, not internet protocol, intellectual property IP, which was basically a simulator. And the genesis of the big idea that transformed the company was, we don't have to change the product. The core IP is there. We need to change it a bit to turn it into a product that will appeal to professional engineers who are designing electronics, and it became a CAD tool. And the company started accelerating and grew quickly, and one of the partners took us out and bought the company. But it wasn't just about innovation. It was looking for new markets and repositioning the business. But these kinds of change, the non-innovation change, comes with a warning. This stuff, by definition, involves marketing. Lots of engineers, I'm guessing lots of people in this room, like me, fall into this category, lean towards engineering more easily than they lean towards marketing. And so things aren't always what they appear with marketing, right? Stuff goes wrong. And when it does go wrong, especially if engineers are running marketing, things get more visible than the creation of a bug in a code base. You might get something like this. So I won't read it, but it's supposed to say 10 flickering lights. That's not what most people see. Or maybe you get this. So this was at the time of the rebranding, as Starbucks decides it's not all about coffee. We have to be broader than that if we're going to compete with other food businesses. And so we're going to introduce food. We try alcohol. We try having some music in the stores. We put in fireplaces and comfy chairs. We're changing the image, and they don't need coffee in the logo anymore. Let's rebrand it. And, didn't work out that great. So the second lesson that I described, if we're going to go through this monumental change, is be careful about the importance of being first. The first mover advantage is not always clear. So here you have a simple little graph. The y-axis down the left is just some metric for measuring the growth of the business or the success. Maybe it's the number of users, maybe it's revenue and sales, it doesn't matter, right? And many of you will have seen these product life cycle curves. So at the bottom left, the curve starts, the product gets introduced, you start to get some traction, you learn what customers are looking for, you add in the features that weren't there in version 1, you're doing some sales and marketing, and you go through the growth phase. And your business starts accelerating, and it's growing. And eventually, the target market segment gets sufficiently penetrated that it's nearing saturation, the curve starts to turn over, the growth rate slows down, and the business matures. That's what people expect when they invest in a business or CEOs are running companies. But what happens is, in some cases, the first company into the space does not get the luxury of going through that whole product life cycle. Something happens. Company 2, or company 3, or product 2, or product 3 come along and disrupt the life cycle of the first company. Before you get a chance to go all the way up the S-curve, you're partway along, you've invested all this money in R&D, and you're still at the introduction or early growth phase. You've definitely not made back your investment. A new thing comes along and disrupts the first one. And that company who thought innovating would be the answer is confused. What happened? We don't understand. We had the first product, we were there first. How did this other company come along? And the term disruptive innovation refers to this idea of a second or third company taking away the first mover advantage. It's coined by a super interesting guy, a professor from Harvard named Clay Christensen. If you want to read about a really cool fellow, read about him. Interesting basketball story, going to Oxford, Mormon conflict with his sports, gets cancer, continues to research and do great stuff, finds out that the number of Harvard students who come back to the reunions are disproportionately overrepresented in the prison population. And why is it that so many CEOs who went to Harvard ended up in jail? And there's all kinds of cool stuff he researches. So here's a few examples. Nothing special about this. I just randomly selected a few. The left column is the innovation or the new idea or the new product. The middle column is who got there first. And the third column on the right is who actually won and ended up being known for that kind of product or innovation. I'm not going to go through all the cells in the matrix. Pocket calculators, TI ends up winning. People think TI started pocket calculators, but that's not who began. Online book selling with Amazon, same story. 35 millimeter cameras with Canon, you get the message, right? So when I'm thinking about whether businesses I'm running would benefit from a first mover advantage versus would they not and why, this is a little tool that I like to look at. So it's simple, I don't mean to get too professorial with you. Across the top is something that I call the pace of market change. All it means, all it refers to is how quickly is the market or the industry changing? Which kinds of customers are changing? What are the customers' expectations? What about the competitors? Are they making changes quickly or slowly? And down the left side, the y-axis is the pace of technology change. How quickly is the underlying technology or intellectual property changing? And based upon which of the four cells you're in, there is some ability, it's not always perfect, but as a generalization, it's true. It's possible for you to predict how important is the first mover advantage. So in the top left quadrant, labeled stable, you have slow market change. So the needs of the customers, their expectations are changing slowly. And the pace of technology change is slow. And here, you can almost always find that there is a first mover advantage likely for someone who can figure it out. It's hard to differentiate from the pioneer if someone does a good job for businesses in that quadrant. If we look to the right, so for businesses that operate in places where the market changes fast, but the technology changes slow, you have an opportunity. It's possible to get a first mover advantage. However, if you do, it's more likely to be because of marketing and distribution and production, non-engineering, non-R&D issues that get you the advantage. Now we go down to the bottom left. Situations where market change is slow, but the technology is changing quickly. Here, a first mover advantage is pretty difficult. It's because it costs a lot of money to get into the first mover advantage. Things are changing quickly. You probably have to hire new people or retrain them. You might start it and partway through the development cycle you have to change. It needs strong R&D and lots of capital. And in the bottom right is kind of the do not go zone. In the bottom right, the market is changing quickly and the technology is changing quickly, and it's really, really tough to get a first mover advantage. And companies that blow their brains out and raise $5 million and $10 million and $30 million in capital trying to get a first mover advantage almost always end up disappointed and surprised when the second or third mover comes in. Watch what the first mover does, learn from the good things, don't make the same mistakes, and take over the lead. So we've talked about what causes change, that it can be thrust upon us. We've talked about the obstacles or impediments that make organizations, not just companies, resist change. We've talked about what change looks like inside organizations, when it's best to innovate, when there are options to change by doing things other than innovation, what happens when stuff goes wrong. We'll finish off with a couple of comments about institutionalizing change. Is it possible to cause organizations to be good at it? Can you change the DNA of an organization? So, absolutely it is possible. That's the good news. Change, being good at it, can be institutionalized. Look at examples like Apple. And here are 3 ways that others tend to see organizations able to institutionalize change. The first one is with leadership. If you have visionary leaders who see change coming, are willing to lead their organizations through it, accept the risk, embrace failure, tolerate things not working, it's okay, that's part of the innovation. Companies or education institutions or hospitals or governments can absolutely become good at this. The second example is success can become self-reinforcing. You do it once, it produces a success, the organization starts to feel good about itself. Maybe you try a second or third one, and maybe 2 out of the 3 work, and everyone starts to see this is a good idea, we should do more of it, and the company supports us and embraces. I don't get criticized for failing. We know not every new idea is going to work, but we have to deal with the change. And it leads to a culture. It's not just at the top or just in the middle. The company, the organization, all the people start to believe that we're a change organization. We like it, we're good at it, we embrace it, we're not afraid, and it becomes part of that DNA. The good news is once you get good at it, it can be used as a strategic advantage. It's a competitive edge when the economy and business is going well. It can help you differentiate from your competitors. And it's a survival or life raft when the economy is in the toilet. Difficult economic conditions the last 6 or 7 years since the Great Recession of 2008. And companies who are good at this have a strategic advantage over others who are more resistant to change. This ability to adapt lets them survive when other companies might not make it. But admittedly, even though you might be convinced it's a good idea, we've talked about some ideas, how to avoid the obstacles, it's still hard. The boss says to the fellow who's brought in the idea, this is an extremely innovative approach, but I'm afraid we can't consider it. It's never been done before. And so this idea that organizations struggle to accept that change is by definition doing something new is really hard to get over. You have to fight like hell to get companies out of the resistant inertia mode and into the change mode. I don't know how the keynotes have gone earlier in the session. I'm happy to take questions from you. I'm going to end with a fun little Dilbert. You've seen a couple of them through the presentation, but this is kind of my summary of what it's like to be in these organizations that are adapting and innovating. We need to foster more of a startup culture to drive the innovation. And so Dilbert asks, oh, that's great. Do we get to dress casually? Do we get to work flexible hours? Do we feel our work is valued? Might I get some equity in the company? And the boss responds, what would be the name of a culture where people work hard, but you don't get any of those things you just mentioned, right? So I'm happy to take questions. I hope you found that useful or interesting. Do we even have microphones set up somewhere? If there's any questions, please put up your hand or go to a microphone. I'm happy to do what I can to respond.
Well, congratulations for the success on change process in Sangoma. I believe that one point that is important to mention is you had a vision where to lead the change. One of the problems we have seen with companies, I made several analyses in Harvard Business School about industries where change was a tragedy. Product had a lot of change, really.
Yeah.
It's not that they resisted change. They tried. They just didn't know where to go.
Yeah.
And same thing, we analyze industries where half of an industry was wiped out because of change. So one thing that is important is one leader has to be strong, but also he has to have a vision where change has to lead. Otherwise, change by itself doesn't help.
No, I mean, of course that's right. Change by itself doesn't help. You're completely right. Part of the hypothesis I was sharing with you is that it's more catastrophic to resist change than to try change and maybe pick the wrong thing. So I do agree, and I don't have any conflict with your idea. There are things that companies who get to the point of institutionalizing this in their culture do to overcome the risk you just described. They tend to do one of two things, sometimes both. There's a phrase in this kind of thinking called low-cost probes. You just try a bunch of stuff, right? You try a bunch of small things, and you see which ones look like there might be some benefit or success to it. And then other organizations, sometimes companies do both, don't place one bet. Thank you for the comment about Sangoma. I would be the first to admit that not everything we tried worked. But it was a very conscious decision not to try one thing only. It's 100% conscious. There was lots of internal debate about that. Some people said, no, we're spreading ourselves too thin. Pick one. We got to make one bet. And this is where some leadership comes in. You must be firm about your beliefs in this area. So Sangoma tried several things, some of which, frankly, didn't work. And here's where the example I gave earlier about how good is a company at culling the ones that don't work, getting rid of them, stop investing money in it, and move on to the other stuff. I'm not that great at that, to be honest. Thank you. Other comments or questions, sir?
So you are looking to the future, and you're prognosticating what's going to happen. And change is constant, and it's always happening.
Yes.
How do you keep from, so you have to incorporate change into your vision. How do you keep from jumping around constantly as change continues to happen?
Yeah. I don't know that my answer to this is going to be any better than anyone. It is a high risk, right? So especially in organizations that get good at change and embrace it and are willing to try it, this is a problem, right? They can be easily distracted, is the word I use. So one of the ways that you can try and combat that distraction is implementing a decision process which is more factual based and less subjective judgment. I'll confess that trying to get the facts that allow you to make decisions that are factually based and not subjective judgment can be hard, but the very step of saying we will not make big strategic decisions about changing the future of a company based on someone's opinion helps a lot. One option might be, something simple like revenue forecast. No, we're not going to bet $4 million on developing that product because you think it's a good idea. Someone has to do the research. You have to go figure out who the target customers are. You have to understand how many of them you might get, and will they pay $1,000 or $100,000 for each widget? And you don't know how many customers you'll get, of course. I'm not trying to pretend that we have some better crystal ball than some, but the rigor of forcing yourselves to go through that process removes some of the bouncing all over the place. But
the fact that it takes so much time to do all that keeps it from bouncing as well.
yeah, so you can think about a curve in engineering, right, with modulation on it, and so you're trying to stay on the main curve, even though there's all this noise modulate, and you have to avoid responding to the noise and just work on that core base signal. Yeah, thank you. Other comments or questions? It's a bit hard for me to see because the lights are pretty bright up here. No? There is?
Two questions.
Yes.
What is your opinion of lean startup as a method of change within a large company? And then also, can you speak any to your acquisition of Free PBX as a means of change?
Yep. You know, there's just a ton of books about startup and how to start up and how to begin new initiatives inside larger organizations, and that's one of them. I, like you, have read it. There's some parts of it I really love and some I struggle with a little bit. There's many others. I guess my view is it's less critical which philosophy or which book or which teacher kind of causes you to embrace or be willing to change in this way. It's much more important to me that we all, if you're going to work inside the technology industry in general or the communication sector more specifically, don't feel trapped in what we do now or what the company was started to do is the thing it has to do forever. If lean startup is the way that you or your company manages to get over that hurdle inside a larger organization, then awesome, right? But if it's not that and it's some other way, that's equally good to me. Second question, Free PBX and Sangoma. One of the things that I've gone through at various stages in my career running multiple companies is the need to strategically analyze what is it about the business model that's attractive and unattractive. So never mind hardware or software or technology or widgets, just how the company generates revenue and finds customers. And Sangoma was in a business in which it sold widgets each once and got paid once and then never again. And one of the companies I ran, the education software business that I mentioned earlier, was the very first industry to go through a change of perpetual software licensing to some form of recurring revenue. That space was called the EDA industry, the electronic design automation industry, and it was one of the most R&D intensive software businesses in the world. So that industry made software for automating the design of integrated circuits. So every time the feature size on an IC got smaller and you could pack more gates or more switches or more transistors onto the same size wafer of silicon, the manufacturing plants had to go through a revolution, the equipment that was on the manufacturing floor had to go through a revolution, and all of the software that was used to design that stuff went through. So the schematics and the simulations and the layouts and what those organizations found who made the software was it was no longer going to be possible to be profitable over the next decade. It just couldn't be done. R&D was costing so much, and the amount of money customers were willing to pay was such that you just couldn't fund it. And so they went through this massive upheaval. The companies who were public had a lot of trouble with this because the transition, and this feeds into the Free PBX story, the transition from perpetual licenses where someone pays you $100 once to recurring revenue where someone pays you $20 every year or $40 every year, whatever the number is. It's not $100, of course. For that complex software, it's $100,000. Hurts. You go find a customer, and last time you found a customer, they gave you $100. You recognize $100 on your income statement. You get paid, $100 in cash goes to the balance sheet. It's awesome. And now, you get to charge $20. But that short-term pain was the secret to survivability for that industry. You just had to have an ugly couple of years to get through the transition. Sangoma recognized the same thing. Part of the dilemma was we were in a space that was so PSTN dependent. But another part of it was we were selling products that were very R&D intense for one time. And what can a company do to change the business model to start generating different forms of income that are recognized different ways? And so it wasn't starting with Free PBX. It was, how do we get into a services business? How do we start charging users annual licenses to use our products rather than pay once? But as we started to experiment with that and get some experience, two things happened. One was we found that being in a business which made connectivity products, so telephony cards, gateways, session border controllers, etc., meant we were missing something at the core. We didn't have the fundamental central piece of the solution. And the other thing we recognized was anything that accelerates the transition from one-time revenue to recurring revenue is hugely beneficial. So that leads to conversations between Free PBX and myself, and the rest is history, and now we have even deeper roots in open source and even stronger coupling to the community. And that strategy now, looking back on it 6 or 8 months ago, looks like absolutely the right bet. No more? Oh, one more at the back. Yes, please.
How important is the acquisition of free PBX and your ties to the free and open source community to the mission of Sangoma going forward?
Yeah. It was probably the thing that I was most worried about, to be completely frank, when doing the acquisition. Not because I was unclear about it, but there have been lots of examples where this was not handled very well in the past, right? We all know them. When I would speak to Danny at Digium about it, he and I would joke about this. The simple fact is Sangoma has its roots in open source. We care immensely about it. We've participated in multiple open source projects, successful and not so much. And so we've never thought there was any uncertainty or ambiguity or lack of clarity about whether we were committed to open source. And we just saw this as more reinforcement and more evidence of it. The thing we were worried about was because past experiences haven't always been great, and some organizations that have done M&A activity into the open source community have then canceled things, there was some concern about reluctance or skepticism on the part of the community. We did everything I could think of to do, to be honest, to be reassuring and explain there's no risk, you don't have to be worried, we're 100% in and committed, and now even more so. And it took a lot of work over the first 3 or 4 months subsequent to the acquisition, but those questions have basically gone away now. I used to get 3 a day, then it went to 1 a day, then it went to once a week. I haven't had a customer or an industry player call me in 2 months saying we're not sure about whether you're committed to open source. So I think we've done what we can. You can't always remove skepticism, but we've tried to be honest and candid, and we're 100% in. Done? No more questions?
Well, it looks like we've got one more here, but that will have to be the last one.
Okay.
Well, I noticed that the rhythm of the changes of the companies are especially for companies from IT. I mean, companies probably they're in Silicon Valley change in a different rhythm than the big corporates. For example, financial companies. Sometimes you can go to that companies and say, you're going to save $10 million, but they say, this is a company that 2 billion company, 2 billion, is too risky for me. And some open source companies probably are not always allowed to take that big companies. How could be a good strategy to change the mind of that big companies?
So, I joked in one of the slides that part of strategy is deciding what not to do, right? So one of the things I would advocate is do not blow your brains out trying to change a huge company for a $10 million savings. You just can't. It doesn't make economic sense, right? I started my career at Nortel. Remember Nortel? Very good company back then. Spectacular business, actually. I had left to be the CEO of a startup before the problems happened, but I watched it with serious interest, and I've taught case studies on it at school. This connects to the big company and what causes big companies to make decisions, and can you change them? If you ask a room full of this size, it doesn't work for 10 people, but over 100 or 1,000 it works. What caused Nortel to go bankrupt? So in the media, the two things that were talked about were excessive management bonuses. Remember that? Guys were getting paid $4 million bonuses, $10 million bonuses. And accounting messiness. Let's not judge whether it was illegal. It's just messy accounting, right? Restatements, things. Nortel was a $20 billion company. Can you make a $20 billion company go bankrupt by paying an executive $4 million? Is it possible? What makes companies go bankrupt? What is bankruptcy? It's the same as borrowing money to buy a car or a house and not being able to repay it, right? It's got nothing to do with $4 million. You can't make a company go bankrupt. It's a $20 billion business by paying management a bonus that's stupid. What happened was they did two big things. And this is why you can't change a huge company by helping them save $10 million. Can't be done. Firstly, they borrowed a bunch of money to fund acquisitions. $7 billion to buy Bay Networks. And then as the economy started to weaken, they became a bank. What does it mean, became a bank? What happened? They started to finance their customers. So the world was changing, regulation was declining, new startups are happening to compete with what were monopoly telephone companies, right? AT&T here, Bell Canada in Canada, BT British Telecom in the UK, Deutsche Telekom, NTT in Japan. All of a sudden there's new startups, and these startups are coming to Nortel, and by the way, competitors of Nortel too, and said, we'd like to buy a bunch of gear from you. We need switches and digital microwave transmission systems and fiber optic OC services. And the only problem is we don't have any money. But we'd really like to buy from you, and here's a purchase order for $250 million. So Nortel said, it's great, we'll take the purchase order for $250 million. Please go and get $25 million. Could you get 20? Oh, we could get 25. Okay, pay us 25, you can pay the rest over time. But what happens when those companies don't succeed? So now you've incurred the cost of building $250 million of gear. Let's assume, because I'm better at grade 4 math than grade 10 math, let's assume they had 50% margins. So it cost them $125 million to make the gear, right? And implement it and send people on site to install it, blah, blah, blah. Then they got paid $25 million before their customer went belly up, and they didn't get paid for the rest. So big companies can only make decisions about important projects in ways that affect materiality. And if you're trying to change a big company either from within as a member of the team or from without, and it's a $5 billion company, and you're trying to save them $5 million, it is really tough, man. Right? It's really, really hard. If it's more material, then the way you change is by trying to find a way to do something in that organization that's separate and apart from the mainstream. The last job I had at Nortel was running a piece of it that dealt with the startup of the wireless industry and how do you build networks for a new cellular company. But you can't do that inside the main part of the company. You got to carve this piece out to the side. That was the last one, right, Dave? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for your time. I enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. And Bill, where will you be if people...
I'm going to hang around here if you want to talk more.
Bill's going to be around if you want to speak to him personally. Now it's back to the sessions. We'll look forward to welcoming you to the happy hour tonight. That's going to be in that area where you got your lunch earlier on. And we're back here for the keynotes tomorrow morning as well. So thank you very much. Have a great afternoon in the conference. You kind of